All right, good morning and welcome to the Tuesday morning Drop Site News live stream. We have a lot to get through today. Secretary of State Marco Rubio just departed Doha, where he's there to ink an expanded security cooperation agreement with the government that Israel just bombed. Apparently, we'll talk about this with or without the knowledge and approval of the United States. The United States bombed another Venezuelan ship in the Caribbean waters, killing at least 3 people, expanding its preemptive war there against the Venezuelan government. Israel is threatening to strike the port of Hodeidah, through which most of the humanitarian aid and other imports get into Yemen. This comes after a strike on Yemeni journalists, which appears to be the single most murderous attack on journalists in history, as far as we can tell. We'll be talking about that with my colleague Sharif Abdel Kadus, and we'll also be talking about the expanded incursion into Gaza City, a stepped up ground invasion, including the mass destruction of high-rise towers throughout Gaza City. Some 700,000 plus people trapped and bombarded in Gaza City. So we're also going to be joined today by my other colleague here, Jeremy Scahill. Jeremy and Sharif, welcome to the Tuesday morning live stream. How are you guys doing?
Good to be with you, Ryan.
Hi, Ryan.
Okay. So let's start with last week's strike on Doha. I was actually with somebody who, when that happened, who lives in Doha but was outside of the city at the time, and we were talking, and he got a call from his wife who said our neighborhood was just bombed. Massive explosion. The children absolutely terrified. And he said, just stay inside, because there could always be a double tap, more strikes coming. This was something that people kind of thought, it would be wrong to say you could never see this coming, because everybody saw this coming. It was more a matter of when, not if. But the fact that we've now crossed into that when is kind of a striking development. So can you talk a little bit about what led up to this strike, who they were targeting, and what we know about it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's important just to quickly remember that it was Israel that blew up the original ceasefire agreement that went into effect in January of this year, that had been endorsed by both outgoing President Joe Biden and incoming President Donald Trump. And in fact, by all accounts, it seems like the only reason Israel really was willing to accept even that agreement, with the caveat that it can violate it at any point it wants. Netanyahu said he got side letters from both Biden and Trump, was because of the pressure from Trump when he was coming into office. And so Israel, throughout the course of the first of what were going to be 3 42-day phases of that agreement, repeatedly violated it. They continued to kill Palestinians. They continued to block the amount of aid that was agreed to come into Gaza. But in general, there was a flow of life essentials coming into the Strip, and Israel had significantly reduced its military strikes on Gaza. On March 2nd, Israel formally sort of said, we're not going to do this anymore. They reimposed this full spectrum blockade. And then by March 18th, they were engaged in the scorched earth terror bombing that has endured to this moment, with the full support of the United States in every possible way. And then there was this phase that went on where Israel was demanding that Hamas accept what was referred to as the Witkoff framework, which was 13 points, some of which Hamas agreed to right out of the gates, and others, really only 3 of them, sort of were points of contention, and they had to do with the Israeli withdrawal, international guarantees that Israel wouldn't resume the genocide, and then unrestricted flow of life essentials and other goods into the Gaza Strip. So this was going back and forth, and Hamas's negotiating team, throughout the course of a few months, kept taking steps toward what the U.S. and Israel said was the line that they needed to stand on in order to secure a ceasefire. And then on August 18th, Hamas actually did something that I think a lot of us didn't expect they would do. They made massive concessions rather than sort of say, we're done with this, the talks are unproductive. And so they agreed to a wide range of terms that they previously had staked out a position against. And in fact, the mediators from Qatar said that Hamas had agreed to 98% of what the US and Israel had been demanding. After they signed that agreement in Cairo, and it wasn't just Hamas, they met with a wide range of Palestinian political factions, groups, leaders, including some that don't have armed resistance wings, including some that are historically not aligned with Hamas. So it wasn't just Hamas doing this, it was a range of Palestinian groups. And from talking to sources within Hamas and other Palestinian groups, I think they felt like they had given up the farm essentially in this process, that they were under pressure from their own people to reach some sort of an agreement. And they felt that they really had taken a massive step, that the US said, if you take this, we're going to get Israel to abide by it. Israel never formally responded to that. And then you had these overt threats from Trump, where he started saying, no more phase deals, no more. And under that agreement that Hamas had made, they would have released 10 of the living Israeli captives, and then 18 of the deceased captives. And in return, they would have gotten a large number of Palestinians who are held captive by Israel out. So instead of responding to what Trump and Netanyahu had said was the deal Hamas needed to accept, after they accept it, they say, oh no, the terms have changed. And now you need to release every single Israeli living and dead immediately, or we're going to rain hell down on you. And Trump himself implied that for the Hamas leadership, things were going to get very nasty. The Israeli chief of staff, a few days before Israel bombed Doha, actually said, we're going to start taking out Hamas leaders abroad. Now, Israeli media and Israeli journalists are reporting that what Trump and other American officials have been floating in recent days, that Trump was only given a kind of immediate heads up that there was going to be this strike in Doha, that in fact is a cover story that was put out. And we talked about this before, and I suggested in several interviews with Al Jazeera and others that I thought that this was a cover story, and it seems quite certain now that it was. And if the fact is that I think Netanyahu and Trump discussed this in detail. Trump had to have given his consent. Remember, Qatar houses U.S. Central Command. It is one of the most important territories that the U.S. has a military facility on for all of its operations in the Middle East. There are extensive American-supplied and in some cases manned air defense systems in Qatar. So for Israel to have been able to carry out this strike would have required advanced U.S. knowledge, and would have also required coordination between Israel and the United States to ensure that Qatar was not able to shoot down any of those missiles. So I think that just based on common sense, on understanding how American covert operations work, and then on the recent leaks from the Israeli media, it seems clear that Donald Trump and Netanyahu were in cahoots prior to this strike happening on the Hamas headquarters. My understanding from speaking to Palestinians who have been in touch with senior leaders from Hamas in recent days. Mind you, these guys are in right now a communication vacuum for security reasons. There have been some posts from people who were targeted in that strike, but in general, they are operating under a new set of rules, some of which have been imposed by Qatar, and others are basic Hamas security infrastructure and how they respond to these. But basically, they tried to assassinate Khalil al-Hayya, who is the political leader externally of Hamas right now. He's the lead negotiator. Bassem Naim, who drop site, we often do interviews with him and have featured him in a lot of our articles. We've interviewed him by video. He also has emerged as an important negotiator in this. He was one of the key figures that dealt with Americans, Adam Bowler and others, when there were direct talks. Ghazi Hamad, who is a Hamas official that has reemerged as an important figure when the discussions have been in Egypt rather than in Qatar, and other officials. Now, they failed, we understand, to kill any senior Hamas leaders or any members of the negotiating team. Instead, they killed 5 people who were effectively either assistants to Hamas leaders or secretaries, office workers. And they also killed the son of Khalil al-Hayya, injured, according to Hamas, Khalil al-Hayya's wife and several of his grandchildren. Khalil al-Hayya did reportedly preside over the prayers at the funeral of his son in Qatar. There have been videos released also of another senior leader, Osama Hamdan, attending the funeral of a Qatari security officer that was also killed in the strike. But what's clear is that the United States and Israel very clearly believed that they wanted to ratchet up the pressure and to try to assassinate Hamas leaders. That failed, but they did kill a number of other people. And I think that what we're seeing now with Marco Rubio going to Qatar is part of the U.S. cover story, but also the United States wants to sort of have it both ways. They want to be able to, on the one hand, allow Israel to strike whenever and wherever it wants in the Middle East, but Trump wants to preserve this U.S. agreement with Qatar, wants to preserve this U.S. colonial base that is a sort of fist that the United States has placed against the region in the form of Central Command in Qatar. And I think it's bloody ironic that Marco Rubio leaves telling reporters, we've almost finalized a new enhanced security agreement with Qatar. And I think the Qataris are very well aware that this is all nonsense, the idea that the United States was not aware of this. In the meantime, you've had this Arab-Islamic summit that's been taking place. And, I think a lot of people in the Arab and Muslim world believe that for the past 2 years, they've watched these leaders of almost every Arab country, with the exception of Yemen. You had Hezbollah in Lebanon, you had some other resistance groups, and then Iran striking back. That with the exception of those countries and political factions, the response from Arab countries has been limited to strongly worded statements. So I think there was some hope that something stronger was going to come out of it. At the end of the day, it didn't. All of these Arab leaders gathered, and they did a kind of version of what they always do, with strong condemnations, calling on the world to intervene. And so, in reality, to sum it up, what we've seen is that the United States either greenlit or permitted Israel to bomb Qatar, a country that houses U.S. Central Command, that Trump visited recently, that the U.S. says falls under a U.S. security umbrella. They allowed that strike to happen. They put together a nonsense cover story about Steve Witkoff trying to call Qatar to warn them, but he was a little bit too late in getting to them. And the message here is that there is nothing that any Arab country or Muslim country is going to do in response to Israel just torching the Middle East and even bombing Qatar, the lead mediator in the ceasefire negotiations.
Yeah, and Sharif, the Iraqi prime minister recently said something like, look, there's no reason why, we couldn't get together and put together a NATO-like security agreement among those of us here in the region, except, of course, there is a reason, and the reason is the United States and the power the United States, has there. So what are the options available to governments beyond, strongly worded statements, and what is it that prevents them from going further?
I mean, this has been a problem for decades, and we've seen an abandonment of the Palestinian cause by their Arab neighbors for decades, essentially starting with Egypt with its normalization agreement with Israel, which secured its, it got Sinai back after losing the entire Sinai Peninsula in the 1967 war, engaged in another war with Israel in 1973 that ended, but Israel still occupied Sinai. And basically, Anwar al-Sadat, the Egyptian president at the time, in the Camp David Accords, which is like the cornerstone agreement for normalization with Israel in the region, agreed to sideline the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian question, in return for getting sovereignty back over Sinai. And ever since then, we've seen a steady erosion that has gotten worse and worse with what, some countries like the Houthis and others call Arab Zionists, essentially falling further and further into the orbit of the United States, and falling further and further into the orbit of Israel, and essentially being allied with Israel in many ways. Now, a lot of these Arab leaders have to speak in the language of the Palestinian cause. Their populations overwhelmingly support Palestine and Palestinians and are against Zionism and Israeli colonial expansion. So you'll hear a lot of this rhetoric that Jeremy referred to and that we saw at this emergency summit in Doha, where there's a lot of bluster talking about how Israel is crossing red lines. They've said this stuff before, maybe not so vociferously, but actually there's no policy change whatsoever. If we look at Egypt, for example, Egypt went to war with Israel in 1948, in 1956, in 1967, and 1973. But since then, Egypt has been complicit in the siege on Gaza since 2007, helping to enforce the siege, destroying the tunnels that provided a lifeline to Gaza. It allows Israel to conduct covert air missions over Sinai. It treats Palestinians from Gaza with not just indignity and reserves kind of special measures for them. We've seen the UAE, as part of what's called the Abraham Accords, normalize relations with Israel in 2020 under the Trump administration, and before 2020, under the Trump administration, and they normalized in a way that no other country, Arab country, has. They have real cultural ties, very, very strong security ties, constant exchange of, there's many Israelis who visit Dubai, for example, and they've been at the forefront of this trend that we've been seeing. Jordan, for example, as well. We saw when Iran fired missiles in retaliation, targeting Tel Aviv, Jordan helped shoot down some of those missiles. And people were extremely angry at Jordan for not shooting down any missiles that Israel is hitting at Gaza. So, we're in the situation where, yes, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of bluster, there's talk of, a NATO force against it, but really only Yemen, Hezbollah, have really taken any action while everyone else has largely stood by. And right now we're watching as the end game is happening in Gaza. This is the ultimate ethnic cleansing plan for Gaza City, the biggest, or what was once the biggest city in historic Palestine. And they're trying to cleanse it, and they're working on it, of 1 million people right now.
Before we get to that, I did want to ask about Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Doha strike specifically. Do you think that they had a heads up here, or do you think that they also greenlit this? Do you think the U.S. would have done this without coordinating with the UAE?
I think I'll let maybe Jeremy answer this, but I would just say one thing that I've seen. I don't think they knew, because they seem to be panicking. They're panicking in a way that they realize, regardless of what you do, regardless of how sycophantic and what you give to Israel and what you give to the United States, Qatar had CENTCOM based there. It gave Trump a $450 million
plane. Yes.
The UAE is completely allied with Israel. But despite that, Qatar was bombed. And I think that you saw the reaction when you saw Mohammed bin Zayed go and hug the Emir of Qatar. This wouldn't have happened in any other circumstance. When you saw condemnation by Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi government, I think they are afraid. They are afraid that there's a serial killer in the neighborhood that is Israel that's running wild, and nothing will stop them from bombing their capitals if they think it's to their advantage. But I'd be interested to know what Jeremy thinks.
Yeah, I don't think there would have been any reason or benefit, particularly to Trump, alerting either Saudi Arabia or the UAE. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have a close relationship that probably also involves Trump's family business in addition to his formal business as the U.S. president. I think that's pretty out in the open. But there wouldn't have been any reason to read them in on this, despite the fact that they're loyal servants of the U.S. agenda in the region, and the kind of carpet that they rolled out for Trump, and the way that they just prostrated themselves before Trump when he visited, on his Gulf tour. At the same time, the Israelis have been very eager to get Qatar out of this negotiation process and out of the determining anything related to the future of Gaza. Israel would much prefer the United Arab Emirates to be taking the lead in whatever happens next in Gaza. And without revealing too much of what we're working on in terms of stories right now, there is a great deal of evidence to suggest that there are secret talks happening that involve the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt in trying to craft a plan for quote unquote post-war Gaza. And I think we're going to see the United Arab Emirates mentioned more and more. Now, the UAE's response was portrayed in the corporate media. The response to the bombing in Doha was portrayed in the corporate media as a big deal because the UAE said, that the issue of normalization and the so-called Abraham Accords might be off the table. They also said this about some of the illegal expansion activity happening in the West Bank and the potential Israeli formal annexation of the entirety of the occupied West Bank. But let's remember the message that has been sent over the past 22, 23 months, very clearly by the United States and Israel, is that there is no red line around Israel, that Netanyahu is allowed, or Israel is allowed, to attack any country it wishes to attack, including American allies that house massive U.S. Military facilities that are of central strategic importance to the U.S. agenda in the region. That is how long of a leash the United States is willing to give Netanyahu. It means there is no actual leash, and that when the U.S. says, oh, you fall under our security umbrella, or we're negotiating an enhanced security agreement, we still may allow Israel to strike you. Now, Trump said over the last 24 hours that Israel's not going to do that again in Qatar. And but minutes later, it's reported in the Israeli media that Netanyahu is saying, actually, we'll strike anywhere, any country that harbors Hamas. So, there's a real question of who's actually in charge here and who's running the agenda. But at the end of the day, when that's the reality, when the United States is empowering a serial killer masquerading as a nation state, when the United States has its Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, going this morning or last night to a help at an excavation site for another illegal settlement, and the State Department posted, about this as well on social media, and there were photos of Netanyahu and Rubio doing this. It means that the so-called Abraham Accords are actually meaningless. Israel doesn't need these anymore. Part of the point of the Abraham Accords was not just capitalism and redrawing the maps of the Middle East, but it was sort of portrayed as a security measure for Israel and a stabilization of the U.S. kind of politics of empire in the region. Israel now realizes it doesn't need it at all. As long as the United States says there's no leash, we're going to continue to arm you, support you, fund you, back you, even when you attack Arab countries that we say are our allies. Nothing matters anymore. So we're on the dawn of an era where everything is out in the open, where the U.S. support for Israel is ceaseless. And where whether it's Netanyahu or some other bloodthirsty prime minister that rises to power under the auspices of being different than Netanyahu, Israel has made clear that it is going to continue its war of annihilation against the Palestinians, and that it reserves the right to strike any Arab country, knowing that they're not going to do anything. And so,
Sharif, this is coming as the ground incursion into Gaza City is really ramping up. Since dawn, drop site daily I saw it was reporting that 62 Palestinians, at least 62 Palestinians have been killed, as well as many, many more wounded. What do we know about, how many people are still in Gaza City, and what's going on there? Because it feels from the coverage like this is a new level of horror being visited on Gaza City.
I mean, it is, and it's being openly bragged about by the Israeli minister, by the Israeli military. The defense minister today posted, "Gaza is burning," and this came as the military spokesperson announced that ground troops are escalating the assault on Gaza City as part of this, major offensive that they announced last month, to take control of the area and to ethnically cleanse it. The spokesperson said that there's 3 divisions have initiated this large-scale ground operation right now. They bragged about how in the past week alone, 850 targets have been hit in Gaza City. So that is the equivalent of something like 120 strikes a day for the course of a week. And last week we saw them announce this this campaign to target high-rise buildings and residential towers in Gaza City, claiming that they're used by Hamas as observation posts and putting out ridiculous graphics showing a surveillance camera on the top of a building, and then supposedly Hamas operations inside these buildings. It very much reminded me of when back in 2023, in the run-up to the invasion and attack on Shifa Hospital, they showed supposedly the command center under Shifa, which of course turned out to be a big lie. But they've targeted just really wiping out residential buildings, high-rise towers, schools, tent encampments where people are around these buildings, malnutrition treatment facilities. And they've destroyed so many iconic multi-story buildings in Gaza City. And this appears to be not just about military tactics. This is erasure. This is the deliberate vanishing and destruction of Palestinian history, Palestinian society. And we saw it in places like Beit Hanun and Rafah, which are completely razed and completely unrecognizable. But it appears to be that this is what the plan is for Gaza City too, which is a much, much bigger urban area. But already the Israeli military has moved in from the north and east of Gaza City, forcibly displacing tens of thousands of Palestinians to the western part of the city. Many are now on the beach and on the coastline. It's just a sea of tents. And many people, as many as the UN estimates over 200,000, have fled to the south. Many can't even flee to the south, even if they wanted to, because it's just too expensive. Our reporting shows it can cost up to 4,000 shekels, which is like $1,200. If you want, a car or anything to carry your things to the south, that's completely unaffordable to people in Gaza. Apparently, when people have gotten there, they're being charged to rent tiny plots of land on which to pitch a tent that they can't even afford. So even people who want to leave, as the Israeli military moves in, they find that they can't. And
on that point, I've seen that reports that there are an increasing number of people not even living in tents.
Yeah, the tents are unaffordable. I've forgotten now how much a tent runs for. I think it's something like $800. There's no tents coming in because there's a complete siege. One of the reporters that contributed for us for a long time, Rasha Boujalel, had to leave her place and move west. She's right near the sea now on a street in a tent with her husband and 5 children. She showed pictures just like a week apart. She put the tent on the rubble of their former family home. She was staying at a friend's house before. And then within a week, that area was surrounded by tents. And Israel is trying to force all of these people out. And in these targeting of towers, it's really just horrendous footage. Abdul Qadir Sabbah, who's kind of the primary journalist reporting for Dropsite from Gaza City right now, has been covering a lot of this. And on Sunday, he filmed outside the Al Mehna building in Tel Al Hawa, which is a neighborhood in southern Gaza City. And Israel basically announced it was going to strike within minutes. And there are just scenes of utter panic and mayhem. There's families hurling out mattresses and any belongings outside the windows of this tower. People are scrambling outside. These things are almost hitting people. You see women screaming. You see this young man collapse to the ground and say, "I can't, I swear I can't," at the idea of being displaced again. And then minutes later, this massive airstrike hits the building. Abdul Qadir told me a couple of weeks ago that I took the quote. He said, "The thing that can hurt you the most psychologically and physically, the thing that destroys your psyche is displacement." And this is what's happening. All of these people have been displaced multiple times. They're being displaced again. They're being ethnically cleansed. They're being driven out of their homes. And all of this is happening, which was a big story before, but because of this military assault right now, we're not talking about as much, during a widening famine. There are people every day starving. The situation's getting worse. It was officially declared a famine by the world's leading expert on food crises just last month. People in Gaza have been saying it's a famine for longer than that. And it's expected to spread to Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah, the very places that Israel is ordering people to displace to. And I'll just finally say that once Israel announced the launch of this offensive against Gaza City, they started issuing multiple displacement orders for different neighborhoods in Gaza City. And this culminated in a displacement order last week for the entire north. And if you look, it was accompanied by a map which showed 3 arrows pointing from the east to the west, and then a massive arrow pointing down. And this is the manifestation of colonial fantasy for them to just clear Palestine of Palestinians. And it's happening right before our eyes. And all the world seems to be able to do is issue words of condemnation. And Israel never pays a price for it and continues. And it's continuing before our eyes. And it seems to be this end game. Abdul Qadir just sent me some video right before we started that I'm sure is going to be of some horror. And so, yeah, this is happening as we speak.
You know, also,
Jeremy, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ron. I was just going to add one point to what Sharif is saying. You know, this morning I was looking at video out of the western part of Nuseirat, where a lot of people are being forced, and you know, Al Mawasi, the sand dunes along the sea. You know, Israel repeatedly bombs Palestinians in the places it tells them will be the safe zones. And this is where we've seen a lot of the direct strikes on tents, the burning alive of children. In fact, last night, you know, as I was going over the footage and the reports that we were receiving from the ground in Gaza, it just seemed like every single person was a child that was being recovered or whose shredded body was being carried. It was just child after child after child, and we're witnessing on an ongoing basis what looked like biblical level exodus, you know, and part of what Israel has done really over the past several months in an acute way is expand the level of horror and criminality beyond what we even imagined a few months ago. Throughout the course of this genocide, Israel has done actions either on the diplomatic level or has started some chicanery involving aid or, you know, a side discussion. Oh, we're going to negotiate. Oh, we're going to send. And it always then kind of people follow along like a cat chasing a ball of yarn. And then what they do is that they escalate the crimes against the Palestinians of Gaza, or they expand their war of annihilation and occupation throughout the West Bank or in occupied Jerusalem. And so part of this is not random. This is part of a doctrine. You know, this is actually something that Noam Chomsky talked about decades ago. This notion that you are you want to show that you don't actually have any limits, and it is a sick, macabre form of deterrence strategy. But at this point, deterrence is not against an armed force. Deterrence is against the existence of a people. Israel is not trying to deter Hamas or Qassam brigades or Soraya al-Quds or Hezbollah. They're trying to deter any, and it's not just Palestinian. What they're really sending a message is any Muslims or Arabs in this region that are not going to play the game that we want them to play, that are not going to bend the knee, that are not going to subject the Palestinians to third-class existence, if they're even allowed to exist, we have a right to just bomb you and annihilate you. So this isn't deterrence against an armed group or armed groups. This is a deterrence against the existence of an entire people. And we need, it's been almost 2 full years of this. The world needs to wake up to this. This is a total, we've been calling it a war of annihilation from the beginning. Those of us who paid attention understood what was going to happen. Now, other people are waking up to it. But my God, how many children are we going to watch burned alive? How many hundreds of thousands of people are we going to watch forced from their homes? How many high-rise buildings housing hundreds of families are we going to stand by and say, that's okay? How many strongly worded statements are they going to issue before somebody says, you know what, it's time that we actually use what we have to stand up? I remember that scene. There was this man who was interviewed, I believe it was on Al Jazeera, and this was months ago, and he was being asked about the response from Arab countries. And he was saying, you know, their tanks are just sitting there getting rusty. You know, there's an iconic clip of Abu Ubaidah, who Israel claimed to have assassinated, you know, the spokesperson for the Qassam brigades and one of the most well-known figures from the Palestinian resistance during this Gaza genocide, where he's addressing Arab nations and calling on them to actually respond to what Israel is doing. And he says, you know, God forbid, you know, you use your military might against it. And that kind of went viral, that notion that it's like, God forbid anyone would actually confront the serial killer that's mass murdering the Palestinians. And the Palestinian resistance is not saying to Egypt, why don't you bomb Israel tomorrow? But I think all Palestinians for decades have recognized no Arab country is going to intervene in any meaningful way to confront Israel. And part of it is because of the hegemonic relationship with the United States. Part of it is because these Arab regimes are more concerned with their own survival than they are with doing the right thing. And part of it has to do with the political relationships they've forged with the United States and its top ally, Israel. And that's a sick scandal. And none of it is secret. It's all out in the open.
That one final thing that we didn't refer to yet is that, after almost 2 years, a UN Commission of Inquiry found what Palestinians have been saying since the very beginning of this, that it's a genocide. What Amnesty International said, what B'Tselem said, what leading genocide scholars have said. They issued over 70-page reports, quite detailed, saying this is genocide. There is an obligation under international law, whatever shred is left of international law after this, to prevent genocide. Not to stand by, but you're supposed to prevent it. And so
right, it's right there in the Geneva Conventions.
Yes, and there's no question anymore that anyone credible, the only people saying that this is not genocide are Israel and the United States, pretty much. Europe, Europe is terrible because it feigns concern, but it doesn't actually change policy. Although there might be some sanctions placed on some elements of Israeli trade. EU is the biggest trading partner for Israel, and after the United States has the most influence over Israel. If they completely sanctioned Israel on trade, then that would have a massive effect. But they usually just feign concern and don't actually do anything about it. But
right.
Yeah, again, what Palestinians have been saying has now supposedly gained credibility in the world's eyes because they never listen to what Palestinians say, but that this is genocide, this is erasure, this is trying to disappear a complete people and wipe them off the face of the planet as a people, as a community, and as a society. And we're watching it happen, and it's all with US weapons and bombs. And
so there's clearly no political limits, no moral limits to what Israel's willing to do here. But what about physical limits? Netanyahu this week said, we're facing increasing isolation and we need to understand that our economy needs to be more autarkic, more internally, circulatory based. This comes as Eurovision threatening, making threats against Israel. As you mentioned, a couple of countries making some small gestures. Spain canceled some contracts with Elbit Systems, and Spain is pretty comprehensively moving away from doing business with Israel. At the same time, put a number on it, but an enormous amount of the news we get out of Tel Aviv is deliberate misdirection. So I want to get your take on how much of this is misdirection, how much is reality. Ahead of this Gaza ethnic cleansing campaign, there were a lot of reports that inside the cabinet meetings, you would have the chief of staff and others saying, we don't have the international legitimacy to carry out this ethnic cleansing, and we don't have the manpower to fully occupy Gaza City long term because the reservists are all shaken with PTSD. They're ready, or there's that entire complication there. We just physically can't do it, and if we try to physically do it, it will be a disaster for us. He's doing it anyway. How much of that is misdirection? How much of that is real? And is Netanyahu pushing the country beyond the physical limits, and it's beyond its resource limits, forgetting the ethics and the morality of it? Is he going to break it?
I think there is. I think the genuine part of this story, or the one that I think is rooted in fact, is getting ground soldiers in to Gaza, from Israel, is going to come with a cost that could prove too high for Israeli society. Israel has lost, relative to its tiny size, a fairly large number of its soldiers, either being taken captive or being killed or wounded in a long-term way. That's true. I think that the Israeli appetite for, because it's such a tiny country, for its soldiers dying is probably not a very strong one. So I think there is some legitimacy to when military commanders who have to deal with their troops every day are looking at these plans. But outside of that, I think that in general, the reports about Netanyahu being motivated by keeping his coalition together or concerns about his political trials, I think these are greatly exaggerated. And one of the facts is that is relevant in recent opinion polls of the Israeli public. A very large majority of Israelis, regardless of their political opinion, of Jewish Israelis, support the Gaza agenda. And I think we have to keep repeating that it's as much as Bernie Sanders wants to pretend there isn't a place called Israel that's doing this, but that it's just a man called Netanyahu and his far right cabinet, the majority of that society is behind this bloodthirsty mass murder campaign. And I think that needs to be repeated over and over. So Netanyahu is at the zenith of his political career. I think he very much believes that this is his moment to run the deck. I think that he really, truly wants to depopulate Gaza entirely of Palestinians, because a long-term Israeli occupation of Gaza is going to mean a war of attrition against the occupation forces there. I also think, Netanyahu is a shrewd student of American politics. We don't know what's going to happen in the midterm elections in the United States. I think that Netanyahu feels like he has a window here that is the best position that a genocidal Israeli leader has ever been in, where you have Trump imposing a kind of authoritarian agenda in the United States, where there is a full carte blanche support for Israel's war of annihilation, where Trump himself put on the table this notion of a Gaza Riviera. Netanyahu likes to talk about it, but he doesn't say it's going to be American run. He talks about it as an Israeli agenda. And I think we have to take him at his word that is the actual agenda here. So, I think that there is a level at which some of the domestic political considerations impact Netanyahu. I think it's been greatly, greatly exaggerated. This is a genocidal, maniacal lunatic who is operating with the full credit, support, and armaments of the United States in an unprecedented manner. And that's taking into account 76 years of unquestioning support. So it's a major, major factor here. Netanyahu believes this is the chance to do it.
I would just add, when we were talking about capability, air power is everything. Air power is everything. And Israel does not have to make any hard decisions because it just gets an unlimited supply of bombs. Unlimited. Think about how many bombs have fallen on Gaza every single day for 2 years now. And not only Gaza, they bombed Lebanon, they bombed Yemen, they bombed Syria, they bombed Iran, they bombed Qatar. There's very few countries they haven't bombed in the region. They have proven to be actually quite a meager fighting force on the ground. After carpet bombing entire areas, troops finally move in, and they still get attacked by fighters who are withstanding a genocide, who are starving, who have nothing more than homemade kind of munitions that they run up to a tank and throw it into and cause casualties, actually. So air power is everything in this. And as long as these bombs keep coming and are supplied, they don't have to make any difficult decisions. They can keep this up. That is the problem. And that's why a lot of the policy comes from the US. That's where it has to change. Israel is not going to stop. It's not going to be convinced to stop. It's not a Netanyahu problem. This is its very ethos as a colonial state. So it has to be stopped by not being able to do it anymore. And the only way to do that is for the support from the US, from Europe to end.
Well, and Sharif, the final contradiction or conflict in this ethnic cleansing campaign that I'm curious to see how you think Israel plans to work out is what do they do with the population that they're trying to expel? And you and I were talking a couple months ago about this contradiction between the Israelis blocking the departure of Palestinians, from Gaza, even as for medical evacuations, for school, for other, for reuniting with family outside, at the same time that they're trying to push the population out. From our understanding, the reporting that we've been doing, that they're actually backing. Israel has significantly backed off of that, and if there is a host country for Palestinians to go to, they're allowing a lot more evacuations. But for a variety of reasons, some of it because they say they don't want to support the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, others just being xenophobic, hostility to new migrants coming to their countries. There aren't a lot of places for people who are working on evacuations, just trying to place dozens of Palestinians, have a very hard time finding host countries willing to accept them. We're talking about dozens. Netanyahu wants to expel upwards of 2 million. And so that leaves the unspeakable of just a total annihilation if there isn't a place for them to go, or a middle ground of just bombing forever, and just one day becomes another and another and another. So yeah, how does this inherent conflict work out?
I mean, I think part of what we've seen with the way, Sharif's point is a really important one about air power. Not just as a superior weapon, to be used against the resources of the Palestinian resistance, which largely is confined to weapons that were manufactured in factories underneath Gaza. And it's remarkable that they continue to be armed and be able to attack Israeli forces. But another point of the massive bombing and why Israel keeps showing pictures of what used to be the city of Rafah is because I think part of the plan is for Israel to make it totally uninhabitable for as many years into the future as possible, so that the conclusion that Palestinians who survive this will draw is no matter what, we need to go somewhere else. Now, Palestinians have shown throughout history that they will fight to their death for their land. But I think Sharif and I both have heard recently from people in Gaza that they're saying we don't even understand how we would be able to live in the conditions that they've created, the toxicity, the targeting of agricultural land, the poisoning of the environment, the utter destruction, razing to the ground. And so, they're trying to create the conditions where they can come to Palestinians and say, we've struck an agreement, for instance, with Haftar in Libya, and you can have this section of Libya is going to be a kind of area where Palestinians can go, and we're going to give you a plot of land, and we're going to give you money. I think these discussions are happening at a diplomatic level behind the scenes, and I think there are Arab governments that are participating in this. Egypt, of course, doesn't want Palestinians to come into the Sinai. Sharif has laid out why, on many of our streams. The logical thing would be to say, well, Palestinians should be able to move eastward then temporarily, and we give land, and we give a massive swath of land back to the Palestinians, and we can rebuild it. That's never going to be a discussion, because this is a war of annihilation. It's a war of expansion. But I think the story will eventually start to develop into that. I think you're going to start to see Arab countries flirting with this idea, despite their rhetoric. I think they're going to claim these things are temporary and Gaza is going to be rebuilt. They'll use every possible parlor trick in the world of diplomacy to try to convince Palestinians to take this deal so that Netanyahu can say, oh, they left voluntarily. And then it becomes a fait accompli. Palestinians know this. If they set foot off their land, they don't get that land back.
And Sharif, the one country, as we were mentioning, the Geneva Conventions literally has it in it that all signatories to it are obligated to prevent genocide, to intervene to prevent genocide. The only country doing it is the Houthi-led government in Yemen. Can you talk a little bit about the strike that we witnessed recently on journalists in Yemen and what we know about it so far?
Yeah, there's actually funeral services held today in Sana'a for as many as 32 Yemeni journalists who were killed in an Israeli airstrike last week. This was a series of strikes that hit several areas in Sana'a, residential areas, a military headquarters, a fuel station, but also a media center housing the headquarters of 2 newspapers. Israeli officials basically admitted to this. They said that they struck a building they referred to as the Houthis' military public relations headquarters. Now, official statements from Ansar Allah have said that 32 journalists were killed. They published photos of them as well. If that is the case, this would make it one of the deadliest, if not the deadliest, strike on journalists in modern history. And it would continue Israel's unprecedented targeting of journalists in Gaza, where over 250, at least over 250 have been killed, including just 3 journalists the other day, by the way, one of which was in Gaza City and 2, I think, in other areas. But those attacks on Sana'a was only the latest in a series of escalating bombings targeting Yemen. In late August, Israel carried out also a series of coordinated strikes that killed numerous senior members of the Houthi-led government that controls the region, in the northern region, including the prime minister and 9 cabinet members. Now, when we say prime minister, I think these officials are largely just figureheads without any real power. But it was an escalation by Israel to openly target civilian members of the Houthi government, even though it probably won't significantly affect the Houthis' military capability. And just today, and it's probably going to happen within a couple of hours, the Israeli military spokesperson said, we are going to bomb Hodeidah, the port city, where most of the humanitarian aid, and Yemen relies extremely heavily on humanitarian aid for millions of impoverished Yemenis to survive, and they're going to bomb this port as well. So these escalations continue, but really the strike that if 32 journalists have been killed in a single strike, I can't think of a deadlier strike, a single strike in recent history.
I think prior to this, I believe that the single deadliest strike on media workers would have been the U.S.-led NATO bombing of Radio Television Serbia in Belgrade in April of 1999, and that killed 16 media workers. Some of them were like makeup artists, etc. But the U.S. also has really been one of the leading so-called democracies in the world to normalize the killing of journalists. Remember, too, if you just even talk exclusively about Al Jazeera, the United States bombed Al Jazeera's Baghdad office early on in the U.S. invasion, killed its correspondent, Tariq Ayoub, who, by the way, was Palestinian. They bombed the Sheraton Hotel in Baghdad, killing a Reuters cameraman, as well as a Spanish cameraman, Jose Cuso. In that strike, they bombed the Sheraton Hotel in Basra, where Al Jazeera journalists were the only guests. They bombed Al Jazeera's offices. This is all the United States, by the way. Bombed Al Jazeera's offices in Afghanistan soon after the U.S. launched its so-called war on terror. The U.S. Kidnapped and imprisoned Sami al-Hajj at Guantanamo, an Al Jazeera cameraman. And the U.S. has participated in the demonizing of journalists who are not telling the official agenda as not real journalists. And so, when we, and also some press freedom organizations have gotten into the weeds about, well, is this person really a journalist? These Palestinians and now Yemenis who are being targeted, I don't think anybody from these Western organizations have any business questioning whether or not they're journalists. When you look at, for instance, the former Israeli soldiers and intelligence officers who are working at U.S. media organizations, whether it's the Wall Street Journal or it's Axios or now CNN, has just hired an Israeli journalist who talks about herself as a proud former soldier, who says she has a weak spot for tanks, who was praising Israeli military units as they went in to take the Philadelphia corridor in Gaza. She's now a senior correspondent for CNN. Who are these people to pretend as though they're the arbiters of who's a real journalist and who's not a real journalist? I mean, so the U.S. news organizations are filled with former spies, retired generals, people who sit on boards of defense companies and make money off of every weapon strike that happens, whether it's Israel or another country. I mean, it's sickening to watch this dehumanization, including by some press freedom organizations that say, well, we need to dig a little bit deeper. But if an American gets taken by Putin, everyone has the ribbon on their Twitter profile. Meanwhile, we've watched almost 300 of our colleagues get mass murdered with U.S. weapons in Gaza. It's sickening.
And some of that violence now seems to be coming back to our hemisphere. Jeremy, I wanted to get your take on this, because the one-way ratchet of violence that starts with there's no start to it, but let's start with the U.S. global war on terror. And then ratcheting further with Israel's expanding assault around the region and decapitation of civilians and scientists around the region. I think there's a relationship between that and the U.S. willingness to now target ships, just boats floating in the Caribbean. So a couple of weeks ago, the Trump administration attacked what it said was a drug boat, provided no evidence. And apparently 11 people burned to death, on this boat, completely 100% in violation of all international law and all marine law. Like, if there's just no way in the civilized world that you can just bomb a ship that is posing no threat to anybody. There are rules around what a Coast Guard would be, any country's Coast Guard would be allowed to do if they felt like the boat was trafficking drugs into their territory. They're entitled to try to stop it, try to issue warnings. But blowing it out of the water is simply not remotely within what is allowed in civilization. They now have done it again yesterday. Killed, according to the United States, according to Trump, killed 3 people, and they claim that it's another drug boat. Pragmatically, it's ludicrous. Like, the idea that you would send out a kind of carrier fleet or a submarine fleet, which costs many millions of dollars a day to operate, and then you're going to eradicate the drug trafficking by actually just attacking the little dinghies that are carrying it is absurd to begin with. But can you talk a little bit about where the U.S. gets this notion that it is entitled to just go around the world and execute, whoever it feels like?
This is what we called, during some reporting we did years ago, the assassination complex. And I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but since the presidency of Gerald Ford, there has been an executive order on the books in the United States. It's never been the issue of whether the United States can assassinate people has never actually been legislated by Congress. And the reason why Congress has never wanted to take on this issue is they don't want to have that debate over what constitutes assassination. But since Gerald Ford, there has been on the books an executive order that prohibits the United States from, or any of its agents from, engaging in assassination. Jimmy Carter amended it at one point to say, to include political assassination, and also to include people operating on behalf of the United States. And so
was that meant to tighten it or loosen it?
It was meant to make it so that it was a much wider application. Carter was deeply concerned. Remember, Jimmy Carter became president coming out of the era of not only political assassination and coups abroad, when it was really out in the open, but also inside of the United States. You had the assassination of Martin Luther King, of Bobby Kennedy, of John F. Kennedy. You had congressional commissions. So it was a big deal. And the concerns were not just external, but internally as well. This notion that Carter wanted it clear that the United States is forbidden by its own values from assassinating. Now, of course, all presidents have engaged in assassination, but it was really Obama, the constitutional law scholar, that embraced the notion that we can circumvent all of these concerns by kind of rebranding it. And Obama leaned very heavily into using special operations forces, the CIA, drone strikes, and they engaged in a form of systematized pre-crime. And much of it was actually waged in the hinterlands of Pakistan and Yemen in the form of drone strikes, to the point that Obama greenlit a strike against an American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was essentially a YouTube personality that was advocating for jihad against the United States. And there was a lot of debate within the Obama, Office of Legal Counsel and within the broader Justice Department about whether or not the president could assassinate an American citizen who had not knowingly committed personally an act of terrorism. They finally were able to secure some form of a designation of Awlaki as a especially globally designated terrorist. But this was very controversial in some legal circles in the United States because of fear that the precedent that it would set. And this was in the case of an American citizen. The US would have meetings under Obama, they called them Terror Tuesdays, where they would literally discuss a deck of cards that would be put out on a monitor, and they would discuss who was going to live and die in Yemen or Pakistan or Afghanistan on any given day. In fact, when Obama was first running for president, he made a comment that got attacked by a lot of people when he said that if Osama bin Laden's location was confirmed inside of Pakistan, that Obama would send American military forces in to get Osama bin Laden. And even John McCain was criticizing him at the time. And then, of course, in 2011, Obama did authorize a covert operation involving SEAL Team 6 and the CIA's Special Operations Division to go in and assassinate Osama bin Laden. They said, it was a kill or capture operation, but it was pretty clear that they went in there to assassinate him. So, while everyone is clutching their pearls right now at what Trump has done in Venezuela, and I think it should be of grave concern, this is pre-crime. Whether or not they were involved with narcotics trafficking is irrelevant to basic international law. You cannot just assassinate someone without due process. These were not people that anyone has said were firing weapons on American vessels. This is not anyone that was launching rockets at the United States. Let's take their story at its surface. These are drug smugglers. Is the new policy of the United States that we're going to put Duterte of the Philippines, his ideas on steroids, and say this is now the policy of the US, that we're going to preemptively murder anyone involved with drug trafficking? If so, this is going to have far-reaching effects. But let's not pretend that Trump's people just invented this right now. There was a constitutional law scholar who remains the most popular Democratic politician in the country that was able to normalize and groom the population, particularly liberals, to believe that these are acceptable types of actions. And so if you weren't saying something when Obama was helping to normalize this practice, but now are filled with rage and concern about Trump, then you actually don't care about the policy. You care about the president implementing it and the bombastic nature of Trump's bragging about murdering people in a pre-crime when we don't even know if they actually were narco traffickers. And even if they were, it's irrelevant. You don't assassinate people in that way and say, well, we're the bearers of democracy in the world.
Yeah, and Trump is now even saying that if you're only a fisherman, you ought to be worried. I want to actually just play a little bit of this, just to show people how completely insane this is. So here's Trump.
I mean, to be honest, if I were a fisherman, I wouldn't want to go fishing. Just a nice, let's take a little trip, because I'd say, man, if maybe they think I have drugs downstairs. I don't want that. I think the fishing business probably been hurt, but.
You see, Trump is sick. Trump is sick in the head with how he talks about this stuff, that it's so outrageous, how he speaks about it. But I'm less interested in his rhetoric than saying, like, where does this come from? It doesn't come from Donald Trump. This is the manifestation in the most grotesque, ugly, outwardly focused way of US policy. He's just doing it in a way that now all of a sudden people are like, oh my God, I can't believe this. But this isn't really new.
Right. Imagine Obama, if Obama had Trump's kind of crass personality.
Yeah.
He very easily could have said while he was president, gee, yeah, I guess I wouldn't go to a wedding if I were in Yemen, because, yeah. I might think to myself, well, a lot of people gathered, good chance I'm going to be struck here. And Obama would find that, offensive that somebody would be so crass as to say that. But but doing it and creating the exact same fear, like Obama put fear into anybody, who was in Yemen and was driving with 2 other trucks anywhere near them. Just the
Well, and they
same way
also
that
killed,
right.
by the way, I think it bears repeating, 2 weeks after they killed Anwar al-Awlaki, this American citizen, they killed his 16-year-old American citizen son. And to this day, no one from the Obama administration has ever explained why they killed that kid. They have never explained it to this day. And there are a handful, and it's only a handful, of American politicians, and some of them are Republican, like Rand Paul, and some are Democrats, like Ron Wyden, who during Obama were actually speaking out against this. I don't think anyone spoke out in terms of the Senate as strongly as Rand Paul did about this. Remember, he held this marathon session where he was talking about the U.S. assassination program. But the fact that we didn't have many Democrats willing to stand up when it was their guy in office makes it much more difficult then to confront a bombastic, sort of continuer of these policies and taking it to the next level. He's doing it openly. It really is like doing what Duterte in the Philippines said. We're just going to kill drug dealers or even drug users. And they're now saying, well, this is going to be the American policy. So in that sense, it is different because it's being announced as like, we're in your face. We're going to be doing this now. And they're going to apply it beyond drug trafficking justification as well. I'm certain of that.
And do you suspect, like, what's your gut tell you about whether or not the U.S. is going to go for an assassination of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro at this point?
I mean, there is a way in which it feels very 1950s right now in this administration. The problem, part of the problem for this administration is that Trump has a big mouth. And I'm sure that, Dulles is the legendary evil director of the CIA is sort of turning over in his grave, watching their operational security, the whole signal scandal that now nobody ever talks about and stuff. But I wouldn't put anything past this administration at that level. We are seeing a very different version of Trump in this term than we saw in his first term. He has totally gotten rid of the wing of his movement that believed in some form of U.S. isolationism. What we're seeing now is the naked face of a couple 100+ years of American history, the ugliest components of it being manifested in this administration. And so I wouldn't put it past Trump to try to assassinate a foreign head of state.
But before you guys go, I wanted to leave you with one act of resistance that's going on in Europe, and get your reaction to this. This is, and I'll play this report from a reporter, a correspondent who produced this for Dropside News. This is so the Genoa dockworkers met recently and held a vote on whether or not to basically shut down the port of Genoa, which then would have a knock-on effect of effectively significantly shutting down commerce in Europe if the flotilla on its way to Gaza is impeded. Let me just play this short video.
Seguiremo le regole dell'umanità, che non sono quelle delle maledette leggi di questo paese. Prima di che sei professionista.
E il fatto che questi attacchi, come dire, potevano in qualche maniera far abbassare il morale.
Per noi non è proprio ammissibile, spiegabile che noi possiamo mandare 17.000 contenitori a Israele e non si riesca a passare 50 tonnellate, e non si riesca a aprire un canale umanitario permanente, e non si possa portare.
Posta dei lavoratori e dei portuali di Genova abbiamo sommato la volontà di proclamare uno sciopero generale. Questa è l'indicazione. Abbiamo detto che questa data è per il momento il 22 di settembre.
So the current date for this strike would be September 22nd. Is this, do you expect this to be another gesture that fizzles? or are we starting to see something here?
I mean, to shut down the port is something new, but to block shipments of weapons destined for Israel by dock workers and longshoremen is not new. This is something that has happened in the United States, in places like Port of Tacoma and Seattle, in Australia, in Canada, in Italy, in South Africa, in Belgium. All of these places have had instances where people take direct action, either dock workers themselves or protesters blocking the dock and preventing the shipment of munitions. Shutting down the entire port, I think it will be much harder to achieve, of course, because the state will come in much heavier. Mm-hmm. But these types of radical actions and direct actions, I think, are what are very much necessary. The famous quote of Mario Savio: "You have to, put your body into the cogs of the machine and stop the machine from working." This is what needs to happen. People need to lie down on the street and stop traffic, because it's just continuing, and the weapons continue to come from the United States. So these very brave dock workers that prevent shipments of weapons from docking, I think is very welcome. I think it's very welcome. The people trying to create a humanitarian corridor through the Flotilla to Gaza, it's very difficult. It hasn't worked in the past, but I think from people I speak to in Gaza, they very much appreciate it. These are the types of actions, direct actions that people can do, where there's some kind of sacrifice to try and stop this war.
Ryan, if you stitch together everything we've seen happen over the past 22 months in terms of how the world community has responded, I'm not talking about exclusively nation states. I mean ordinary people, whether it's students or it's the dock workers or the longshoremen, medical workers around the world. And then, yes, the pressure that resulted then in some European and other governments doing more than they have in the past. And in some cases, going far beyond what even people in their own country thought was possible. If we stitch together all of this and look at the quilt that is emerging of this world response, and then we juxtapose that with the mass murder, the systematic attempt to annihilate the Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but increasingly now focusing on the occupied West Bank and occupied Jerusalem. If this isn't the moment that the world collectively wakes up and decides Israel must be confronted, that an entity that refers to itself as a nation state that is backed by the United States, if it is allowed to operate like this in the world, what is the point of any international institution? What is the point of any international law anymore? So, when I watch that speech, and I agree, it's inspirational. This is the moment of truth of the past 76 years, because it's all out in the open. No one can claim they don't understand it. Only a narrow group of very sadistic, evil people can claim that the truth is not true right now. And so that's the challenge in front of all of us. Now, what does the world do? What do you do when you can't deny any of it because it's out in the open in front of you?
All right. Well, Jeremy and Sharif, thank you so much for joining us. And also for everybody watching, if there's one other thing you could do, I did want to thank everybody who is a reader of Dropside News, has been so supportive of our journalism, but also this, if you didn't see it, we launched a new Gaza Journalist Fund, which is raising money to help up to 29, and I think we're going to expand the number now as we vet new journalists who are being forced out of Gaza City, elsewhere inside Gaza, or forced out of Gaza entirely, evacuating. The costs that Sharif talked about are serious. We set a goal of raising $150,000 for this fund. It's now at $193,190 just since Thursday when we launched this. And so a huge thank you to everybody who kicked in. Just because it's over the goal doesn't mean you should stop giving. 100% of it go to those journalists, and their families. And their need is not small. And so if more is raised, more will go to them. Unfortunately, they will need it because of the cost of transportation, the cost of fuel, the cost of food, the cost of tents, cost of a tiny plot of land to put the tent on. is just absolutely astronomical. Money has already flowed to 3 journalists in Gaza, and you know, it can't ease. It can only slightly ease the horrifying and unspeakable conditions that they're living in, but that's better than trying to do it, you know, completely broke. So thank you to everybody who's you know, chipped into that, and thank you to everybody who has, you know, supported Dropsite News. You can learn more about that at dropsitenews.com. Jeremy and Trifa, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you guys next week.
Take care.